Welcome to Sober Sunrise, a podcast bringing you AA speaker meetings with stories of experience, strength, and hope from around the world. We bring you several new speakers weekly, so be sure to subscribe. We hope to always remain an ad-free podcast, so if you'd like to help us remain self-supporting, please visit our website at sober-sunrise.com. Whether you join us in the morning or at night, there's nothing better than a sober sunrise. We hope that you enjoy today's speaker.
Hi everybody, my name is Tim Heil and I'm an alcoholic. But since April the 12th of 1990, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink of alcohol or other mood-altering substance, and that's been the best thing that's ever happened to me. And it's really good to be here, really good to be in Oklahoma, and I want to thank everybody. Bubba, thanks for the introduction. You know, I saw who was hosting me and who was introducing me. I said, well, that's the way it would be. They would give the guy from Kentucky the Bubba to start things off with. And he doesn't look like a Bubba, but he said when he gets out of a suit, he looks like a Bubba. And thanks to all of you. And Pawpaw, thanks to you, buddy. I had no idea. I drove all the way up here with Larry today, and if I had known your birthday, I wouldn't have had you spend so much money on me at breakfast. I am grateful to be here. You know, I was just thinking, I know many of you from different events in Texas, especially the Texas Man-to-Man in Lake Brownwood, a number of you that I met 10 years ago. And somewhere in my story, hopefully I mentioned that. You know, 10 years ago, in 1999, I was 9 years sober. My rear end was on fire. I was wondering what sobriety was all about. And I ended up in Lake Brownwood, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And my life changed. And ever since then, you know, it's been an interesting uphill deal for me. And it's so special to be here. I really mean that. I love being at men's conferences. They have been so important in my sobriety, almost over not the last 19 years. And, you know, I've never ceased to be amazed. I haven't been doing this as long as Mike and Gary and the other speakers have, but, you know, I still have to pinch myself sometimes to think, you know, I'm in Ardmore, Oklahoma, at the Lake Murray. And I think sometimes, how does a guy like me get to a place like that? You know, when I think of how I grew up and where I came from. And, you know, I grew up in an Irish Catholic family and from Kentucky. And my daddy, I was about 10 years old one time, and he said to me, Tim, there's only 3 things you need to know about living out there in the world, and here they are. Keep in mind, I'm an Irish Catholic from Kentucky. He said, football, you pull for Notre Dame. Basketball, you pull for Kentucky, and you vote the straight Democratic ticket. That's it, kid. Now get out there and live. You know? Now that's a pretty small world to start out in, and I think some of you could just change the names. You can relate to that. Because the truth is, by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, April 12th of 1990, that small world had gotten so small that it was down to me, and if you weren't me, then I didn't want you in my life, and I wanted to be by myself, and that's where I'd gotten myself on April 12th of 1990. And, you know, I just love that because today, you know, when I need to tell you my world has gotten so big, and I've gotten to go so many places as a direct result of, you know, being in Alcoholics Anonymous. I just can't imagine it sometimes. And, you know, our book says we are people who normally would not mix. You know, and I love AA, you know, and I really believe this. You know, I hate to say this in front of a bunch of men, but I really believe someday people will look back on AA as one of the greatest love stories, you know, that God ever created. I truly mean that. I think it's one big love story. It has been from the beginning, and I'm so grateful to be a part of that. But, you know, the people that you meet and the people you don't expect to meet. My home group is the Lampton Street group, and it's in the inner city of downtown Louisville. And I just happened to end up there because my office is not too far from there. But as a direct result of my home group being down in the inner city, probably about 75% of the men I sponsor in AA are black men. They're African-American men. It's just kind of where I hang out. And I don't think a whole lot about it. I really don't. It's just kind of where I grew up in AA. But about 2 years ago, I was down around there, and they changed this one-way street to a two-way street. And I'm going down this street this one particular morning to turn left on the expressway, and evidently this guy behind me doesn't know it's not a one-way street any longer, and he pops right in the back of me. You know, we're out in the street, and it's an elderly black man who hit me, and he and his wife, and we're standing out there in the middle of the street waiting for the police to come. And, you know, keep in mind I'm about 3 blocks from my home group now, but we're standing there, and all of a sudden here comes 2 guys down the side of the street, both black. They run over to me and say, "Hey, Tim, you all right, man? You all right?" I said, "Yeah, guys, go ahead. I'm okay. Go ahead." About that time, here come two other guys, both black. They run over to me. Tim, you okay? Anything we can do for you, buddy? I said, no, man, it's okay. About that time, car came off expressway. 5 guys in there, all black men. They ran over to me and said, Tim, are you hurt? Can we take you to the hospital? Anything we can do for you, man? You know, and I didn't think anything about it. I turned around, that old black man was standing there. He went, who are you anyway? You know what? And I didn't know what to tell him. I just want to say, I'm a drunk. I mean, I don't know what to tell you, but you know, that's the type of thing that happens in our world, in Alcoholics Anonymous. Another situation, you know, I'm in Indian country, and I was thinking about this. I was asked to go speak at a Cherokee, North Carolina, a couple of years ago on a Cherokee Indian reservation. And I was real new at this, and I was still really nervous about it. And I get there on the reservation, and I'm the only non-Native American speaker. You know, I'm the only non-Indian. Pretty clear, I don't look like an Indian. 6'4", blue-eyed guy. And I get up here, and I'm real nervous, and I look down there, there's the chief, and there's the shaman guy, and there's the, I don't know, all the head guys are sitting down there, and man, I'm real nervous, and next thing I hear myself saying is, hey guys, you know what, when I was a kid, you know, when I used to watch those cowboys and Indians movies, I pulled for the Indians, I swear I did. I looked at the chief and he started laughing, and I started to relax, but after the meeting he came up to me and said, you know, we started to wonder about you, but when you told that lie, we knew you were in the right place. Oh, man. So, you know, the world in Alcoholics Anonymous is this unexplainable, but it's so beautiful. And, you know, and I can show up here today and feel absolutely 100% right where I need to be. You know, and that's such a special thing. And if you're new, stick around and be a part of that. And if you're new, you know, I want to tell you right off the bat, and I know there's some new people here. We can tell. We know who you are. And, but, you know, I want to tell you something before I start, because when I was new, what I did when I showed up to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I would sit where you're sitting and I'd listen to the speaker, I would listen to what the speaker did that I didn't do. That's what I was really interested in. And I'd come and I'd listen to the speaker. Let's say Gary was speaking, and I'd be sitting there thinking, well, I did that, did not do that. Next night, next speaker. Did it, did that, did not do that, did not do that. I was just doing this every meeting, and I was at probably 6 weeks in AA, and a lady, of all things, is speaking. And I'm listening to this woman's story, and everything this lady did, I did. I'm listening to her story going, man, I did that. Oh, man, I did that too. Oh, I'm screwed. I did that too. But right at the end of her talk, she said she used to carry a half pint in her bra. I said, I did not do that. And I remember telling some old guy after the meeting about it, and he said, sounds like you're getting a little desperate there to me, kid. And I said, what do you mean? And I said, you know, because the deal was I was kind of looking for what an alcoholic looked like. And you guys said, well, kind of like you. I said, no, you know what I mean. Dirty old man, raincoat. And you guys said, no, we don't know what you mean. And you know what? It was confusing. It's still confusing. You know, I looked around, couldn't tell you were an alcoholic by looking at you. You know, and the stories, you know what? The stories were really different. They were all over the board, you know. So I couldn't tell you were an alcoholic by looking at you. The stories kind of confused me. But here's what I wanted to share with you is that I kept coming back, and as I listened to what your stories, no matter what you did or you didn't do, you know, 3 things started to jump out at me that trapped me in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the first thing was you all were talking about being restless, irritable, and discontent. The second thing you were talking about being apart from, not a part of. And the third thing you were talking about was being progressive patterns of dishonesty in your life. See, man, because when I heard those 3 things, I was screwed. I was trapped. Because those 3 things have been part of my life from the get-go. Those 3 things, you know, I've wrestled with in Alcoholics Anonymous for the last 18 and a half years, you know. And you know what? Restless, irritable, and discontent. You know, our book talks about it. I don't know what it is. Just got it. You know, wake up with it. You know, I've had it as long as I can ever remember. And what I clearly remember, when I was about 14 years old, I put alcohol on it. It took it away. You know, I never forgot that. Sometimes the most powerful thing I hear any of us share sometimes, you know, you say to somebody, hey, how's it going? And he says something like, I don't know, Tim, man, I don't know. See, man, I'm not quite centered. You know, things just can't quite right. Do you know? I go, yeah, I know. I know what you're talking about. You know, I just never knew what to do with it. And you know, you heard many people talk about whatever that is, our hole in our soul that the wind blows through. I just know that alcohol, very early on, worked very well for me with that. You know, the second thing you're all talking about was being apart from, not a part of. You know, and I really need to say this because the only thing I've really done right is you all told me to stay in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. See, because there's a part of me still, I've been doing this for about 10 years, there's still a part of me that shows up to a place like this and goes, man, what am I doing here? They have no idea who I am. I'm not like them. My God, they'll find out I'm from Kentucky sooner or later, you know. There's always that moment, you know, of separation. There's always a part of me that wants to separate from the pack. You know, I got 6 little grandbabies, and I like to watch old movies with them. And one of my favorite movies of all time is E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Remember that movie? When it came out back in the 80s, when it first came out, I was out there, it was about 83, 84, and I was rip-roaring drunk one night, and I was taking this girl that I think I was engaged to, you know, one of those deals, out to see this movie. And anyway, I'm in the movie about half loaded, but there's a part in the movie, if you remember it, where O.E.T., the little Martian guy, you know, he gets all green and gray and crinkly, you know, he's drying up, you know, he's dying. He's absolutely dying, but all of a sudden he looks up in the sky and he goes, home, home, E.T. home. Man, tears just started running down my face. And this girl I was with said, what is wrong with you? I said, I know just how he feels. And you know what? I could tell that same story in church. Nobody gets it. You tell that in AA, everybody says, oh yeah, man, I know. Home. Home, home, home. You know, I wanted to be there, didn't know where it was trying to get somewhere, going as fast as I could for many, many years. Wouldn't know when I got there, but I just know I wasn't where I needed to be. Alcohol was a great transformer for me. And then the third thing I heard you talking about were progressive patterns of dishonesty in your life. Man, and when I heard that really grabbed me because what I realized, I was a guy who lied when the truth was good enough. You know, I remember even thinking back when I was a kid. You know, when I played basketball, you know, and I came home, if I scored 20 points, I came home, you'd say, how many points you score? I'd say 24. You know, got a B on the test, what'd you get? B+. You know, I can remember thinking even as a kid, why do I do that? And here's what I've come to realize. Why wasn't the truth ever good enough for me? That was really going to be important to me, obviously, when I showed up here. I was about 3 months sober, and I'd gotten back with my family. My 13-year-old daughter and I was sitting up watching the Late Show one night, and you know, out of this 3 months sober, I couldn't sleep. And so all of a sudden my daughter says, Dad, can I order a pizza? And I said, oh, honey, no, don't do that. It's too late. Your mother will go crazy. She said, oh, come on, let me. I said, all right, go ahead. So she orders a pizza. 1:15 in the morning, doorbell rings. You know, it's the pizza man. Well, my wife, you know, comes storming out of the bedroom, starts screaming at my daughter, going, what are you doing getting a pizza at 1:15 in the morning? My daughter said, well, Dad said I could. My wife said, you say she could? I said, no. And my daughter said, Dad, you're lying. I said, I know it. I do it all the time. You know, and I say all that to say this, you know, restless, irritable, and discontent, apart from, not a part of, and progressive patterns of dishonesty in my life. Now, what I know today, which I didn't know when I showed up, is that you guys were going to give me the total package of a solution for what I just described as a spiritual malady. You know, restless, irritable, and discontent, you basically said you're going to need to find a hookup to the God of your understanding, because sometimes that's the only thing that's going to give you the peace that you're looking for. You know, apart from, not a part of, we give you the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And all you got to do is drag your raggedy old butt in here and stay a part of it, irregardless of how you feel, think, or believe. And the last thing, about learning to tell the truth and accept the truth in my life. You know, you gave me the 12 steps. And if you said you continue to practice these, you'll learn that your truth is always good enough. And if you can learn to live in your truth, then you can stay sober and you can stay alive. You know, so I'm so grateful, you know, that I finally came to understand one thing, that, you know, I have a disease of alcoholism, which is body, mind, and soul. And you guys gave me the total package of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm so, so, so grateful for that. You know, I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. I was the oldest of 7 kids. It wasn't if you were going to drink, it was, you know, when and how good were you going to do it, you know. It's just the way it was. And, Interestingly enough, we had lots of drinking going on for many generations. Interestingly enough, I was the first alcoholic, I think. As it turned out, we had, as I could see, we had two types of people in our family. We had a lot of nervous people, and we had characters. You guys have any characters in your family? Man, we had a ton of those guys. I had a bunch of uncles. It would be stuff like, my dad would say, well, yeah, you remember when Uncle Mike got all drunked up, and Uncle Tom was climbing through the window, and he was drunk too, and Uncle Mike woke up and he shot him. And everybody'd laugh and have another drink, And then my dad would say, man, he was a character. And I remember being a little kid saying, Dad, he's a killer. What are you talking about? We had lots of characters. We had lots of nervous guys. We didn't have any alcoholics. And I guess you're understanding what I'm saying is that it was everywhere, both sides of my family. My grandpa on my mom's side was a whiskey drinking in and out of VA hospital, whiskey drinking drunk. But never could call him that. I was about 10 years old one Thanksgiving. I remember sitting there while I was watching the football game, and I looked in, and here comes Pawpaw, coming through the front lawn, and I could tell he was all drunked up, but I'm sitting there watching the football game. Pawpaw comes in, falls over the lamp right in my lap, Of course, my mom comes in, grabs him, takes him back. I heard her screaming at him back there, don't you ever come in here like that again. But I remember the thing was, later on after he was gone, I asked my dad, I said, Dad, what's the deal with Pawpaws? My dad said, well, Timmy, he was in World War I, and when he was over there, he got gassed real bad. I remember thinking, yeah, he got gassed. That old Yellowstone whiskey underneath that table was gassed in. But anyway, what I'm saying is that, alcoholism. And I grew up in an environment where we all had the ability to look at about the first 2 or 3 hours of the drinking episode and a total ability to forget what happened at the end of the night, And I guess if you're going to be alcoholic, that's almost a condition that we all have to develop sooner or later, and we certainly did it in my family. What I will share with you about my drinking from this point forward is that alcohol would start to take from me when I was about 17 years old, everything that would ever mean anything to me. And I really say that, because sometimes as I've gotten older in this whole thing, I look back and, to those periods. I got grandkids now, and I guess we all, somewhere in our life, we have hopes, we have dreams. We have the idea of what life should be for us, and I was like that, Same thing. I wanted to grow up. I was an athlete. I wanted to be an NBA player, Other than that, I just wanted to have a nice wife, a house, and they live the American dream, and I say that because what I can look at as alcohol came into my life, it quickly prevented any and all that from ever happening until I got to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's why I'm so grateful sometimes to see you young people here. Sometimes it blows me away to see people 17, 18, 19, 20 sitting in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I think, man, my hope for you is that if you can understand what's wrong with you, you won't have to live, the tragedy of losing the most important things in your life. And the very first thing for me was I was a good athlete. And in Kentucky, if you can shoot a basketball, then, that's a good deal. And that's about the only thing I could really do well. And I was an all-state basketball player. Name was in the paper a lot. Picture was in the paper a lot. And the only reason I even mention that is it was a big deal to me because it's the only thing I really cared about. It was who I was. It was my whole self-esteem, because other than that, I was a 6'4", goofy, pimply, afraid of girls type of guy. But man, on the basketball court, it's where my identity was. And I say that because what happened to me in 1966, I got a scholarship to Division I college, St. Louis University. That's really great, a Catholic college for a Catholic kid. First one in my family to go to school, much less go on a scholarship. Huge deal for me. Huge deal for my whole family. And I left there in 66 in all my glory. And what I want to share with you is this is the point in time where I can look back and the alcohol and alcoholism, starts to take from me everything that would ever mean anything to me. When I showed up to that university, and by the first game of my sophomore year, because you couldn't play as a freshman in those days, I showed up so drunk that the other players had to hide me on the end of the bench so they wouldn't throw me out of school. And so this was Division I. This wasn't YMCA, so this is like going to Texas or Oklahoma or we played Drake in those days in Wichita State. North Texas State was in our conference back then, and you got a kid just stone drunk on the end of the bench. When I look back on that particular incident when I got into AA one time, And I want to share with you, there was two things that happened that day that really will continue through the rest of my story. And the first thing was this, is that, I had no clue at 17, 18 years old about a physical allergy or mental obsession. I certainly didn't have any clue about a phenomenon of craving. And what happened that particular day of the game, I came out of class, the guy said, "You want to go get a drink?" I said, "Well, yeah." I always said, yeah. And I had a mind that said, all right, we're going to have a couple beers, come back, get a nap, get a shower, go to the game, be a hero. That's what my mind said. Didn't know anything about physical allergy or mental obsession, phenomenon of craving. And the other part of this equation is, my sponsor is a guy who talks a lot about this being an extreme disorder of the ego. And I really took that to heart, and I looked at that, because there's a part of me, and it happened this day too, there's a part of me that no matter what team I'm on or I'm working with you, especially in relationship, I come to realize sooner or later that I'm not getting the respect that a man of my stature should be getting. It just has always happened to me. I don't know about you guys. In jobs, in relationships, I start to notice for some reason that I'm not getting the respect that a man of my stature should be getting. And it's really a problematic thing, because as you perceive your stature getting higher, it makes it tougher on the other people that you're around. And that's what happened that day. Two things happened. The coach said the day before who was going to play, who wasn't going to play. I wasn't going to get in, hurt my feelings, and that whole deal started. When little Timmy's feelings got hurt, he loved to drink. And the second thing was I had no idea that the first drink was a problem for me. And so the combination of the two things, I showed up to that game very, very drunk. And here I am, the most important thing in my life is what I'm trying to say to you. At 17 years old, the only thing I would have told you that meant anything to me, alcohol has now moved ahead of it. There used to be an old guy in our area that used to talk about alcohol was his friend, it was his buddy. He used to throw it in the back seat, and they'd drive around and have a great time. And he said then one day he woke up, he's in the back seat, alcohol was driving, and it was taking him wherever it wanted to go. And at 17, 18 years old, that's where I was. And from that point forward, alcohol would start to dictate for me on a daily basis what I did, how I did it, where I did it, and especially where I ended up on any given day. And it also started to necessitate that I had to start, compromising the values that my family had given me, because they had given me good values. But if you're broke and you need to drink every day, then you need to do what you have to do. So if I had to steal, I stole. I used to take some tests for people because I had some brains, So the whole moral fiber of this young guy who had left Louisville in all his glory within 2 years, is already being deteriorated because of the need to find a way to drink on a daily basis. I hung around, and as you probably guessed, the basketball came to an abrupt end about in my first part of my junior year. And you know what? I really didn't even care too much anymore, because the alcohol had become the only thing that I had understood was making life viable, that made life okay. But I hung around there, and in 1970, it came to 1970. In 1970, I had enough credits to graduate. My grades weren't very good. If you go back to 1970, some of you can, there was only two things you could really do. You could go to work if you could, or you go to war. And I wasn't too interested in either one. I kind of wanted to keep the party going if I could, was my idea. And I really say this because as meager as it may seem to you, it was my life at that time, I figured, was pretty much in the balance. And there was two ways you could get out of the draft. They had a lottery back then. If some of you go back to that point in time, my lottery number was 6, So I'm going, But there was two ways at that time you could get a deferment from the draft. You could get married, and I thought, man, that's awful drastic. Or you could go to grad school, all right? So here I come for the first time, as I remember it in my adult life, coming up with the plan for Tim's life. And I thought, here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. Now, hang with me here, because as insane as this might sound, some of you are going to understand it perfectly. My thought was this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go take the test to get into law school. I'm going to get into law, pass that test, get into law school, graduate from law school, eventually run for Congress, and someday President of the United States. Now here's the deal. As insane as that sounds, that's the way I think. And for me, it's a short trip from street drunk to President of the United States. It's just the way I think. And as you might guess, I went and took the test. And having been a daily drinker for the last 4 years, I got an awful score on the LSAT, and the law school turned me down. And now, I remember getting that thing in the mail, And then again, as meager as it may sound to you all, now I really thought, what are you going to do now, Tim? Because you're going, buddy. It's Vietnam, Vietnam, Vietnam. You're going to be shooting them up. You better come up with a new plan. And it actually popped into my head, how about this, Tim? Why don't you stop drinking? Why don't you stop drinking? Because you can pass that test. Stop drinking, study for that test, and pass that test. So for the next 5 weeks, I stopped drinking, and it was awful, I'm going to tell you, because I'd pretty much been a daily drinker. Stopped drinking, got over the shakes, got a guy to tutor me. We worked every day. I put every ounce of brains and energy that God had given me into studying for this test for the second time. 5 weeks of the best God gave me. Came down to the day before the second test. I made a slight change to my plan. Test was on a Saturday morning. I came home on Friday afternoon. I said, all right, here's the new plan. I'm going to go out and get a couple beers so I can relax, come back, get a good night's sleep, get up, take that test, pass that test, Congress, President of the United States. Same plan, one little change. I went out that Friday afternoon. I didn't get back to the college the following Tuesday. Found out later on I rode around St. Louis on a city bus about a day and a half of what I know now today is called a blackout. Had no concept what was going on then. You know, I can particularly remember the guys, before I left that afternoon, they said, Tim, don't do it. You're going to blow it all. I said, guys, do I look stupid? I will be back. I will be back in this dormitory by 8 o'clock. You can write it down. And you know what? I believed that in my heart, and if you'd given me a polygraph, I'd have passed it. Because I didn't know anything, guys, about a physical allergy. I didn't know anything about phenomenon of craving until I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. Crazy thing happens there. This is how my life was starting to go. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I realized I wasn't going to be taking the test. And I went back to the dormitory, and I found a real smart guy. He was right down the hall from me. And I paid him $25 to go take the test for me. And I went out and stayed loaded for 3.5 days. So this guy takes the test. About 3 weeks later, I got the results of the test that the guy took for me. The damn guy got the highest score in the history of the law school. Unbelievable. And of course, crazy as I was, I remember looking at this guy going, you know, what the hell you done to me now? I give you responsibility, now you got me in a jam. You know, here's what I want to share to you. Here I am, 23 years old, and I'm thinking I better get to them before they get to me. And I called the dean of the law school and I said, sir, can I come and see you? And I'll never forget this because, you know, I guess there's certain moments that stick with you sometimes. And why this one does, I don't know. But I showed up and the dean was sitting there. You know, and he never said a word the whole time I was there. He just looked at me and I did what you have to do, right? I started to lie. And I said, well, Dean, you're probably wondering about the difference in them two scores. The last minute I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. I let some other guy take it. How did he do? You know, as if I didn't know. And, you know, I knew he knew I was lying. Don't know if you've been there. I was there many times. But what I want to share with you, and I don't know why I remember this, for one moment as I turned to leave that dean's office, I knew the truth. What went through my mind was, Tim, you know what the problem is, man. It's the booze. The booze took the basketball away, and the booze took your opportunity to go to law school because you got the brains, damn it, and you know it. It's the alcohol. You know, I don't know why I remembered that, you know, because it did not last long. I walked out of that, you know, dean's office that day. There were two guys that I knew. They said, you won't get a drink? I said, yeah. That was 1970, you know, and I was off and running. It was going to be 20 years till I got to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, and I came back to Louisville. In 4 short years, here's what happened. Here's this young hero kid that left Louisville. In 4 short years, I'm sneaking back into the city. My whole life is a lie. I'm going to come back to Louisville, and now I'm going to, as a direct result of alcohol and alcoholism, I'm starting my whole life on a dishonest basis, because I had to come back and tell everybody I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. And, you know, thank God for moms. The only person that knew the truth about what happened was my mom until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, you know. And at 23 years old, I'm going to try to build, you know, our book talks about pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. You know, and I think that comes in many packages, and it comes in many forms. And I can look back, and I wouldn't have told you that then, but at 23 years old, I was already there. I was already taking away the moral fiber, the integrity that I had. And I was going to try to make it from there to do the best I could. Interesting thing, I came back and took the draft physical, and I flunked the draft physical on a congenital birth defect. I thought, hell, that would have saved me a lot of trouble, you know. Man. But when I came back to Louisville, I got into teaching and coaching because, I got a job coaching, and they made me this is great. They made me, at the first job I had, I was the basketball coach, and I was the dean of students at this all-boys Catholic high school. That's a bad place to put a drunk, as a dean of students. Because I was in charge of discipline, you see. And I'll tell you this story, and I want to tell you why, because there's lots of stories from this era of my life. But I'm the dean of students, and so I'm in charge of all these kids coming in the morning. And this is back in the 70s, right? And all the kids are out in the parking lot, hitting a few doobies before they come into school and whatnot. And I'm sitting there this one morning, as I was many mornings, like big old tomato head, just trying to get through that first couple hours, just not wanting to talk to anybody. But this particular day I look up, and this kid's standing up over me. He's got that long army jacket on, had that long hair we had back in the 70s. Man, you could just smell the reefer was everywhere, and his eyes were all glassed over, and he was just kind of floating over top of my desk like this. And all of a sudden he looked down and went, "Hey, Mr. Island, you're looking bad, dude." Oh man, let me tell you why I tell you that story. And I think I said something to him like, "By God, I'm in charge here, and don't you forget it." The reason I tell you that particular story, and there's lots of stories from that era, is that kid that said that to me that day, last summer, celebrated 26 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. He lives down in Destin, Florida. He's a multimillionaire. I swear to God, and he's a great member of AA. I went down there a couple years ago for a conference, and he met me at the plane, and he had his kids with him. And he ran over, he called me Coach. He said, "Hey, Coach, come here." He said, "Look, I ain't ever told my kids about how I was." He said, "I'll make you a deal. You don't say anything about me, I won't say anything about you." And you know what? That has been such a neat part of my recovery. I did the teaching, coaching thing the best I could, with the impediment of alcoholism that I had for about 7 or 8 years. But in my recovery for me, and God's been so good to me, He's given me the opportunity to redo and to remake up some of the areas that I fell down so badly. And one of the things He's enabled me to do is sponsor and work with some of those same boys that I tried to teach and coach back in the 70s. And now I sponsor them in Alcoholics Anonymous. How about this for a special gift? How about having 3 brothers that I coached back in the 70s, all came into AA 90 days apart. And I got to sponsor all 3 of those. I still tend to call them kids, and they're all 50 years old. I got to sponsor all 3 of them, and they're all now 4 years sober in AA. See, that doesn't happen. It doesn't get any better than that. Those are the types of things I've been able to do. Let me tell you very quickly, sometimes I share this and sometimes I don't. I think it's great to share in the men's group because I like to have fun in Alcoholics Anonymous. I love to laugh. I thank God for the people that were here that made me laugh when I got here, because there was nothing funny about anything when I showed up in Alcoholics Anonymous. But let me tell you about one of those kids, because this has been an important part of my recovery. His name was Chris. And not only did I teach and coach Chris in high school, I had known Chris since he was a little baby. His family lives 2 streets from mine. He was the youngest of the family, where I was the oldest, 10 years apart. And sure enough, when I was about 5 years sober, he showed up in AA. And I became a sponsor, and we did the deal, man. And we ran and did our steps and did the meetings. And what happened, all of a sudden, I stopped seeing Chris. He stopped coming to the meetings. He stopped calling me. And once in a while, he'd stop by my office, and I'd say, "Man, what's going on?" He said, "Well, Tim, I don't do AA anymore, but what I do," he said, "I work in the Big Brothers program, and I help these little kids, you see. And Tim, it's a really good thing. It makes me feel good, and I know I'm helping these kids, and it's kind of like AA, Tim. It's kind of like AA." And I remember saying to him, because the old people timers that brought me into AA used to always tell me this, and I said, "Chris, look, the old timers told me that I need to be around my own kind. I'm a drunk, and I need to be around other drunks just like me." I said, "I'm sure the Big Brothers is a good thing, but man, I'd like to see you back in the rooms." And you know what happened to Chris? His life took an unexpected turn, as many of ours do. And what happened to Chris was that he had a baby by a lady, and for the first year of that baby's life, the mother didn't want it, and Chris raised this little baby all by himself. He loved that little girl like you couldn't believe. But what happened was, the second year, the mother went to the court and came back, and just out of meanness took that baby girl away from him and would not let him see that child. And what happened to Chris is he went into that obsession of mind. He went into that spiral of depression that our book talks about. And he started calling me, and he was convinced he was never going to see that baby. When I was about 7 years sober, and the reason I share this, because it was a pivotal change in my whole way I saw this program. He called me one day and he said, Tim, I can't take this anymore. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. It was 2 days before St. Patrick's Day. I'll never forget it, in March, about this time of the year. And I said, Chris, the only thing I know to do, son, let's get together tomorrow. We'll get on our knees. We'll do the third step and ask God to help you with this. You know, that's the only thing that I have to give you. And what I need to share with you guys is that never happened. Because about 2 o'clock that morning, I got a call from another guy I sponsored. He said, Tim, I'm at Chris's house and he's dead. I want to share with you this message. I went over there, and here's what I saw. I saw this 6'2" blonde kid that I'd known since he was a baby. And he was sitting in a lawn chair next to his car, and underneath the chair was an empty quart of Jack Daniels, and the hose from the exhaust was draped across his lap. You know, and I'll never forget this. And I can't tell you how important it became in my sobriety, because I looked at him, and what went through my mind was this. I thought about the big brothers, and I thought about all that good stuff he was doing for those kids. But what went through my mind was this. You know what? You can make me the deacon of 50 churches. You can make me the head of the Boy Scouts of America for everywhere. You can make me head of the Mother Teresa fan club. You know, the world can make me all of that if it wants to. But if I forget, first and foremost, what I am and where I belong, you can forget about the rest. I truly believe that. It was such a message to me. You know, it was such a, because, you know, I'm coming up on 19 years sober. I have guys that I came to AA with that I never see. And I run into them sometime and say, hey, man, what's going on? They go, oh, Tim, you know, I can't get to meetings, but, you know, I'm coaching Little League, real involved in my church. And I always think, well, man, I hope it works for you. I hope that works for you. See, because I think about Chris and I think about the message that I got that day. That I really believe that there's one thing that's worked for people like you and me, and we're right in the middle of it right now. And if I can remember to keep that first, then God, in my case, has opened up all that to me. I'm on board of directors. I am the president of the board of directors of a halfway house I was telling Larry about. But, you know, I remember his mother at the funeral saying to me, Timmy, I don't understand. I said, well, no, what don't you understand? She said, I don't understand how a life problem can get so bad that you pick up a quart of whiskey and you take your life. And I looked at this poor lady and I understood that she did not understand. By God, I did. And I hope you do. I hope you do, because, see, it was such a message to me, and I tell Chris a story sometime, because what it did for me, it drove me right back into the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have never, ever wavered since then. You know, also, when I came back from college, I married my high school sweetheart. We could do about 2 or 3 workshops on this part of my story. We got married in 1970. We got divorced for the first time in 1983. I remarried her in 1985. We got divorced again in 1987. I remarried in 1990, and we divorced again in 1994. Usually, you know, you tell people at your work that, they go, what? You share it in AA, everybody goes, oh, hell, sounds normal to us. You know that. And, you know, what I can tell you today, what is that all about? Well, I know today what it's all about. It's about alcoholism and everything that goes with it. You know, I love him, I hate him. He's good, he's bad. What you really had there were 2 pretty good people trying the best they could to figure out, not knowing what the problem was. You know, that's the best we could do, not knowing what the disease of alcoholism was all about on both sides of the fence. And I'll say this very quickly. I have a tremendous respect for Al-Anon and what goes on with that side of our disease, you know. Also, we had 3 beautiful children, you know, that were born during that period in the early 70s. And I know there's a lot of dads in here. And how about as a gift having your oldest son, you know, born on Christmas morning? In 1971, that was God's gift to me. And I missed the gift, guys. I missed the gift, and I was to miss many gifts like this. Because that morning, I was in the hospital, but instead of being in a delivery room where I was supposed to be, I was in the men's room spitting up whiskey. And all I could think about is I got to get out of here. And I got to get somewhere to get a drink because my head's splitting. I missed the gift, you know. God almighty, I missed so many gifts. You know, and I really missed that kid growing up, because by the time that my little Christmas baby was 17 years old and I was getting sober, he was on his way off to college. And I was 6 months sober. And he says to me one day, hey, Dad, I want to talk to you before I go. And I'm 6 months sober, so I immediately started thinking, yeah. he probably wants to tell me how proud he is of me that I'm 6 months sober. I'm sure that's probably it. So we have our little meeting. I said, what is it, son, you'd like to say to me? He said, Dad, I only have one thing I want to say to you. He said, I hate you. He said, I hate you, Dad, and let me tell you why. I hate you because all you think about is you. He said, even you, since you stopped drinking, all you think about is you. Bye. Man, I was crushed. I'm thinking, I can't believe this kid said that to me, 6 months sober. And I made a critical, fatal mistake. I took this problem to the wrong group of old-timers in Alcoholics Anonymous. They were not kind. But they gave me a lesson that I'd never forget, and I always like to share it if you're new. Here's what they said to me. They said, you think you're getting credibility back in your life in 6 months? You drank for 27 years, Tim. It ain't going to work that way. But we will tell you this, Tim. You will get credibility back in your life one day at a time by not drinking and doing the next right thing. Ooh, it didn't sound too good to me. It still doesn't sound too good to me at times. But you will get it back, Tim, credibility one day at a time by not drinking and doing the next right thing. And you know what I need to share with you? That's exactly been my story. 8 years into my sobriety. 8 years. My little Christmas baby, who was all grown up by this time, called me from Seattle, Washington, and his butt was on fire. And he needed help. But you know what? He knew his daddy was different. He knew his daddy listened to him when he talked to him. He knew his daddy was helping a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. He knew something was different. And he said, Dad, can I come home and can I live with you at 8 years sober? And he did that. And we lived together for about a year. And that very gentle healing that we are promised in Alcoholics Anonymous started to happen. And it only had happened one day at a time by me not drinking and learning to grow up in Alcoholics Anonymous. And today, 10 years after that, 5 years ago, his mom and I helped him start his own business. He has, 2 little 7-year-old granddaughters who are my granddaughters. And I will promise you, not only does he not mind that those kids get to spend time with me, he loves every minute that those girls get to spend with their pawpaws. And that's a long way from, Dad, I hate you, all you think about is you. But guys, the only way that's come to me, is one day at a time. By not drinking and sticking around other men in AA, trying to learn how to grow up and how to learn to be a father and how to be a friend and how to be a husband. I told you I did the teaching and coaching thing, and I did that to the best of my ability through the 70s. And then as I remember it, I came to kind of the end of the 70s and starting to notice that I wasn't getting the respect that a man of my stature should be getting. And so I left that, and I did what every drunk does sooner or later. I started my own business, And that was in 1980. I told you I got sober April 12th of 1990. Let me talk to you about the decade of the 80s. Well, it's not a good decade for me. I've already told you, I'll give you a kind of a capsule of it. Already told you, got divorced in 1983, remarried her in 1985, divorced her in 1987, got back together with her in 1990. I was engaged to 2 other women in between time. I was in the nut house on 3 different occasions. I went through 14 different business partners. I lived 15 different places in the 80s. I got shot at twice. I got cut up with a beer bottle, and I lost $250,000. And I was thinking, this is going okay. We're like always the last to know, always. 1980, when I got thrown out in 1983, I was living with my mom and dad. I know some of you have been there now. Living with mom and dad, and I remember running the guys I went to high school with, and they'd say, hey, man, what are you doing? I'd say, well, I'm president of my own company. They'd say, no kidding, where are you living? I'd say, well, mom and dad. From 1982 to 1985, I went through 5 psychiatrists, and that was just a simple deal. I kept them until they started talking about alcohol. They started talking about alcohol, fired them, got me a new guy. Just the way it was going. That's as simple as it was. I was taking antidepressants of all kinds, chasing it with whiskey and beer on a daily basis. If you're using that recipe, I need to tell you it did not work very well for me. 1985, New Year's Eve 1985, the book talks about we get to a point, can't live drunk, can't live sober. That particular day, I knew the truth, I couldn't escape it. The thrill was gone. No matter how much whiskey I drank that day, I knew the truth. And the truth was, Tim, you're a bum, you're a drunk, you're a washout, you're a hero child, you're living with your mom and dad, man. That's who you are. But I didn't know what to do with that, guys. You know, I didn't know what to do with that. I'd like to die. I wanted to kill myself, but I didn't know anything to do with that. And that was the first time they drug me to the asylum on New Year's Eve in 1985. My brother Tommy, who's, thank God, is in this program today. But he drugged me over there, and I want to tell you this story as I remember it, because this is what my alcoholism's all about. They put me in a little detox room, and someday I'm going to find this nurse and get her side of the story, but here's how I remember it. She set me down there, and she came in, and she said, well, honey, why don't you tell me about it? I said, all right, I'll tell you about it. You know, a couple years ago, in 1983, my first wife threw me out with no reason that I can think of. And then I got engaged to this other woman and bought her this ring, and she took off with the ring before I even paid for it. And, oh, yeah, did I tell you? My daddy went to prison when I was 12. And you know, I have to do everything in my work. I work with a bunch of idiots, and my family, they're so messed up, ma'am, you would not believe it. I just started laying all this stuff out. And I don't know, guys, how long I'm there. Maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And I came in totally suicidal. But I'll never forget that she looked me right in the eye and she said, honey, you certainly have a right to feel the way you do. And I thought, God, you are so right, lady. What was I thinking? If people had messed over you like they messed over me, by God, you'd be drunk and depressed too. I wasn't there an hour and a half and I was completely cured. I swear to God, I spent the next 28 days in the asylum trying to help everybody else. You know? I did. I thought God sent me there on a mission. They made me head of the stress class. I still got a blue ribbon. I made the best ceramic in the shop. Nuts. Want to hear insanity? About halfway through that stay, I'm walking down the hall one day, and the nurse says, would you like a pass out tonight? And I must have thought she said, you want to pass out tonight? I said, what? She said, yeah, you're doing really great. If you want to go out for a couple hours, as long as you're back by curfew. I said, thank you. That's very nice. Called my best buddy. He picks me up at the asylum. We go right to the watering hole. You know, slam down 6, 8 beers, get a couple shots of whiskey. Got us a big old bottle of wine. You know, I'm telling about all the people I'm helping back to the hospital. You know. 10:45. We're both drunk, man. 11:45, I look at my watch. I said, I got curfew back to the nut house. You got to get me back. So we both pile in the car drunk, and we go back to the asylum. And he's driving. I'm in the passenger side. And I go to get out. And I look at him. He's just got tears coming down his face. I said, what is wrong with you? He said, Tim, you don't belong in there. I do. Oh, man. And I think I said something like, you know, I think you're right, and when I get out of here, I'll help you. And guys, that's 1985. You know, it was going to be 5 years before I showed up in Alcoholics Anonymous. And you know what I did? I did what I always did. I came out of the nut house. I got me a new girlfriend. I got me a new place to live. I got me a new business partner. I started over. I was always starting over. In fact, if you listen to our stories in AA, we are the best starter overs in the world. Don't finish much of anything, but we can flat start over, man. And that's what I did. I came back and I got with what I call my most frequent wife, and we tried it again. You know, we tried it again. We got a new house. We tried the whole deal, and it just got worse. And she threw me out again late 1989. And I spent the last 6 months of my drinking living in a guy's basement out in the south end of Louisville. You know, and I can't tell you anything drastic happened there as I think back on it. Except now I was the president of my own company living in a guy's basement, which I thought was a step up from living with your parents, you know, so I guess I was grasping at straws at the time. April the 12th of 1990, I woke up like I always do out of that basement. I'd finished the night before, you know, had 6, 7 beers just sitting there watching ESPN. This was the anticlimactic end for me. And I don't know what to tell you other than something started to come over me that night, and I went to bed, and that morning when I woke up, I just got dressed, and I kind of marched myself into my office just like I always do. And I'm in a business, guys, that's very busy. You know, the phones ring constantly. People are in and out of the office constantly. That day, April 12th of 1990, I went in and sat down about 7:45 in the morning. I never moved a muscle till noon. And that day, the phone never rang one time. Nobody ever came in that office that day. And I had a sense, as our book talks about, is that, Tim, you know what the deal is, man, and it's over. It's the booze, and you know it's the booze. And I reached in my desk drawer, and there was a directory of the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, which a guy had left, you know, give me 2.5 years before. It was right there at my right hand. And, you know, that was the day I went to my first meeting of AA, you know, because I didn't really understand what you know, my problem was. I did understand this. It certainly had something to do with alcohol and my consumption thereof. You know, did I know about alcohol and alcoholism? Was I willing to call myself an alcoholic? But somehow God took me to that meeting that day, and the journey began. And you know what I want to share about that? From that day to this moment now, my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous, I need to tell you in a general way, it has been at times, I have laughed harder, guys, than I ever thought I could laugh. I have also cried harder and deeper than I ever thought possible. I have felt pain more acutely than I ever knew could exist. And see, the reason I say that, and if you're new, I hate to bring this up, but if you were like me when I got here, I was really hoping sobriety was going to be about the absence of problems in my life. And you guys said, nuh-uh. That ain't what it's about, Tim. What it's about, though, you will be able to be part of life and part of whatever God has in store for you. And thank God that's the case, because guys, what I need to tell you over the last 18 and a half years, I've laughed, I've cried. I've had 2 marital situations sober. I've watched my mom die. I've watched my dad die. I've had 2 guys I sponsored in Alcoholics Anonymous kill themselves. I had a guy that I sponsored in the inner city for 8 years, got gunned down 2 years ago right in the middle of the street. I've been able to be a part of life and life's terms. And see, the difference is what I'm trying to say is, I've been able to be there. Body, mind, and soul. My wife back in the day used to say this to me, Tim, you're not even here when you're here. And I'd get so mad. I said, what do you mean I'm here? She said, no, you're not. And see, what I understand today about alcoholism, it is a disease of body, mind, and soul. And the translation to me is that I'm either drinking, I'm thinking about drinking, or I'm thinking about me. And if that's your problem, you can't be a father, you can't be a husband, you can't be present much anywhere. And the reason I know that is I got these 6 little grandkids, and guys, I can sit up in the treehouse for 2 hours with these guys. And Tim Hyland did not do that. I can sit for 3 hours and play board games with these little guys. And a guy like me just couldn't do that, you see. Because even if I had my body there, I couldn't give you my spirit. I couldn't give you my mind. And thank you so much for that, because over 18 and a half years, very slowly, I've been able to be present as a father, as a grandfather, as a husband, as an employer, I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I hung around for about 14 months. And I mean literally hung around. Didn't have a sponsor, didn't have a home group. If you'd have run into me about that time and said, hey, Tim, how you doing, man? You happy, joyous, and free? I'd said, yeah, you stupid idiot. Can't you tell? I'm having a ball. And my first sponsor was a little guy that I met, and he had this little saying he used to always give me, because I couldn't even sleep at night. He would say, Tim, just repeat to yourself over and over and over that God is love, God is love, God is love. And I still go to sleep this way sometimes to calm myself down. But I want to tell you, 14 months, drier than a bone, hadn't done a thing in Alcoholics Anonymous. God is love was not getting it done. And I thought this one day, if that little sucker, if I call a little sucker and he gives me God is love one more time, I'm going to crack him. I am going to go get him. And sure enough, I called him about the issue of the day, and sure enough, he said, Tim, just remember, God is love. I said, damn it, I know that. I know that, but I'm so angry and I'm so depressed. He said, good, I think you're ready. I said, ready for what? He said, listen very closely, Tim. He said, in Alcoholics Anonymous, God is love, but love is action. God is love. Steps 1, 2, and 3, your powerlessness, His power. Steps 4 through 9, your simple responsibility to clean up your mess. Step 10 is a great refresher course for you every day. Step 11 hooks you up with your God. And step 12 hooks you up with us. What do you think, Tim? You ready? I said, yes, sir, I am ready, because I cannot live any longer, in my skin without doing something. And I say that because at 14 months, he sent me down to what's my home group today, the Lambton Baptist Church down in the inner city of Louisville, and I became the coffee maker in that meeting on Wednesday morning. And he put me in a big book study on Wednesday nights in my office, and that big book study is still there today. And I did the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I guess you know what I'm going to say is that, guys, I went from the outskirts of Alcoholics Anonymous looking in, and all of a sudden, I found the greatest secret that Alcoholics Anonymous has. You know where the fun is? You know where the people that got it going on are? They are right flat in the middle, man. They are the ones doing the coffee. They're the ones that put this conference together. They are the ones that got their hands all over this. And I wouldn't have guessed it out there on the corners where I was. But thank God, through the pain and the help of you people, somebody drove me in there. And I don't ever want to be on the outskirts again. And if you're there tonight, please get in the middle. Get right in the middle. Get involved. For me, I have to be a hands-on type of guy. I also, when I told you when I showed up here, I owed $250,000 to people who really wanted it back. They really did, and they bothered me about it a whole lot, And I remember thinking, boy, this is unfair, a guy trying to get sober, and they're just pestering me all the time about wanting their money back. It doesn't seem right. I mean, it was awful. And I would go in every day to my office, and of course, being a drunk, I'm trying to think of one big deal to come up with $250,000, right? And I'd get to about 10 o'clock in the day, and I would just get so full of fear, I would just shut down, go home, roll up in a ball, and go to sleep. So I'm just dying. I'm just dying. But I'm at a meeting one night. There's an old fellow sitting there, and I start whining to him about my business and about all this money I owe. And he said, sit down. He said, tell me about it. I said, what? He said, tell me about your business. I said, well, it opens at 8 o'clock. He said, good. Be there at 8 o'clock. He said, what next? I said, well, I'm supposed to do sales calls at 9. He said, good. Do sales calls. He said, what's next? I said, well, I'll go to lunch. He said, good. Go to lunch. Tim, come back from lunch. I thought, well, that's a good problem. I had a problem with that. So what's next? I said, well, I come home, I do my paperwork in the afternoon. He said, good, do your paperwork. What's next? I said, well, work's over at 4:45. He said, good. Go home. Have dinner with your family. Go to your meeting. Come home. Say your prayers. And then he hit me with a big one. He said, and Tim, do the same thing the next day. And I remember thinking, man, what a concept. What a concept. And see, what I'm saying to you is, what that old man said to me was what my sponsor calls the stitches. He was telling me this, Tim, you do the stitches and trust that and leave the patterns up to God. You do the stitches and leave the patterns up to God. See, my problem, guys, is when I start stitching, I start thinking, what am I making? Hat, shirt, pants, what color is it going to be? When's it going to be done? And I'm nuts. And I stop stitching. And he told me, no, you just stitch. You just do the next thing in front of you and trust that God's pattern is always going to be so much better than you would ever figure out. And that's what I did. I started getting there at 8 o'clock, going on my sales calls, going to lunch, coming back from lunch, and all the time thinking, this is stupid. I'm not getting anywhere. I still owe $250,000, but I still kept doing what that man told me to do. 5 years later, here's the sequel to the story. I come back from my home group one day, and I did that for 5 years. I come back from a home group, there's 5 messages there. 4 of them were from guys in AA, and the last one was from the local business paper, in Louisville. It was a reporter. So I called my AA guys, and then I called this reporter. And this reporter, it was a lady, she said, Mr. Highland, listen, your business has been referred to us as one of the fastest growing businesses of its kind in the area. We'd like to do an article on it. I said, man, that'd be great. And then she says this. She said, well, tell me about it. What did you do to really turn your business around? I said, see, my office opens at 8 o'clock. I get there on time. And I went right through the whole deal. I do my sales calls. I go to lunch. I come back from lunch. I do my paperwork. And I go home and I do pretty much the same thing every day. And when I finished telling her, there was like silence on the other end of the phone. And don't get me wrong, guys. There's a part of me that, boy, it's got the story. There's a part of me screaming to say, well, I came up with this incredible idea. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and through my self-will and incredible knowledge, I turned this business around. I mean, it's screaming to say that. But the other thing is, when I hung up the phone and she goes, well, thank you, sir. We'll see what we can do. And I knew, guys, there was not going to be an article. I knew when I hung up the phone. But I also knew I had told her the truth. See, because that's been the staple of my sobriety ever since, is that my job is always going to be to do the stitches. It took me 9 years in my sobriety to pay off that $250,000, one day at a time. 9 years by doing the same little stitches that old man had told me, to do. Let me share real quickly. I told you that, we laugh a lot about relationship failures. Those marriages to my most frequent wife, that it was not funny at the time. Especially 4 years sober, when I lost my marriage 4 years sober. It was very, very painful. And I went on for that point in 4 years sober, and I hung around Alcoholics Anonymous, tried to date. Boy, that was an awkward thing. I didn't know how to do it. and just worked with newcomers. But, got itchy. Figured what I really need is, somebody who understands me, somebody who's on the same spiritual path that I'm on. And I started looking around the rooms of AA, and I found her, I found her. And honest to God, I thought it was the most perfect thing we both did that ever could have happened. And we dated, for about 6 months and had this big AA wedding in 1998, I guess it was, and it lasted 8 months. 8 months, and you talk about being driven to your knees in a whole different way. I was like 9 years sober. I was starting to do this, what I'm doing tonight. I'm sponsoring a lot of guys in AA, and I'm asking myself, what is wrong with you, Tim? What is so inherently wrong with you that you cannot have a relationship with another person? And ironically enough, there's an old fellow in our neighborhood named Jack Sullivan, who Gary probably remembers. And Jack sent me down to Lake Brownwood to the man-to-man hairy leg conference, and I'm going to be the speaker, for God's sakes. And I show up there about as beat up and battered as I've ever been in my life. And this is the way AA is, guys. I'm the speaker, and I go to Brownwood to try to give what I got. And you know what happened to me that weekend? I got it back from you guys. I had a bunch of hairy-legged old Texans down there lift me up. And by the time I left from there, they re-convinced me that, Tim, you're a good man. We all got problems. Stay sober. Keep doing what you're doing and walk forward. It was such a pivotal time. And the guys here, so much so that from that point in 99, I've been back to that conference, 5 or 6 times. It was very, very embarrassing. And I went on from that point, went back and got about the business of being, in AA and doing what I'm supposed to do. But I want to tell you, I was a totally different guy. Strange thing happened on my way to long-term celibacy. About 2 years after that, my most frequent wife, the mother of my children, called me one day and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, nothing, And she said, "Well, I'm taking the kids on vacation. Would you like to go?" I said, "Well, yeah, I ain't got nothing to do." So we went, took the kids on vacation, and, it was just totally a platonic thing. I had my place where I was living. She had her place where we was living. But here's what I want to share with you guys is that, here's 2 people. You heard the story. We've known each other since we were 17. You heard that story. And here we are already 50-some-odd years old at this point in time. And we started something really different. We became friends for the first time in our whole life. We actually became parents and co-parents for the first time. We became grandparents and we built this incredible friendship. Then we started to date. We never had dated in our whole life and all that mess that you listened. And we built a friendship. I sold my place and I eventually moved in with her. And then one night we're sitting there. She looks at me and I look at her and I said, "Well, what do you think?" This coming November the 28th, we will be celebrating our 39th gross anniversary. I have no idea what the net is. No idea. And what I want to share with you, I remember saying to my sponsor one time, "This is pretty crazy, huh?" And he said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Tim, think about this. If our program is about anything, it's about transformation. Transformation. You know what about transformation? We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to look. And we don't know who's going to be involved. Because God transforms. We don't. And I have to think that's what happened there, guys, because sometimes I look back, the 2 of us look back and go, what was the problem in the first place? And we're having a great ride as parents and a great ride as grandparents. I'll tell this very quickly. I had some issues, man, and, you just don't know till you don't know. When I was early in AA, I was having so much relationship problems, so much problem getting along with people at my work. I had this little group of gurus in AA, and they said, "Tim, what you don't have is any communication skills." They said, "We're going to help you out." So instead of saying screw you to people, he said, "Here's what we want you to do. When people engage you or she engages you, you just say back to her, 'Well, how can I help? How can I help?'" That's one. And then what happened, I started using "how can I help?" And it didn't take me too long to figure out there were some people who didn't want my help. So I told these guys, "What do you say then?" They said, "Well, you just tell them, 'Well, I'm sorry you feel that way.'" So I got "how can you help? I'm sorry you feel that way." And they said, "Okay, and validate other people by telling them they might be right." Oh, man. Now I got it going now. I got "how can you help? Sorry you feel that way. Hey, you might be right." And like any good drunk, I am using it way too much. I'm using it at work, I'm using it at home, but it seems to be working better than screw you, I'm out of here, One particular night, I'm at my men's meeting. We have a men's meeting on Tuesday night. It was a great meeting, man. I'm spiritually charged up, kind of flew home on my wings, into the house and sit down at the kitchen, just spiritually really up there. And all hell's breaking loose in the house. My wife's yelling at my daughter's yelling at my sons, and they're all yelling together. About that time, my wife comes in the kitchen. I'm sitting there. And before I could say a word, she said, "And don't give me that how can you help shit." I said, "Honey, I'm sorry you feel that way." She said, "You asshole." I said, "You might be right." And here's what I'm going to tell you. Every time I tell that story, after the meeting, about 3 or 4 guys come up and go, "What were those things, man?" Here's the deal. If you write them down, you are on your own, And I'm sure all those things, the Al-Anons never like to hear that story, by the way, but all those things used in the right way. Let me finish up with this. I have been so blessed to be part of this. I guess sometimes you tell your story and you go, wow. I mean, we can all laugh about it today. It wasn't funny. I had 3 kids, the 2 boys, the Christmas baby and my middle son. And I had a baby girl. My daughter is my baby girl. And, from the get-go, I knew that she was her daddy's daughter. From the get-go, I knew that she was the one. Her first little phrase when she was a toddler was, "I'd do it myself." Her second little phrase was, "You're not the boss to me." So that's this child, and sure enough, she was her daddy's daughter, and she got ripping and roaring all through high school, and about 7, 8 years ago, she took off on her run, and she left Louisville, and she went to Chicago, and a very gifted child, very beautiful, very gifted in lots of ways, except she had the same disease that her old man had. And she left Chicago on a run, and she ended up going all the way out to Los Angeles, and about 6.5 years ago, she came home to Louisville, and I want to tell you guys, I hadn't seen her, but I knew what was going on. And she came home, she's 5'9", blonde, blue-eyed, and her teeth were falling out, her eyes were sunken back in her head, her cheeks were all caving in. She weighed less than 100 pounds. She was living in her car in the streets of Los Angeles. And I knew she was dying out there from the disease of alcoholism. But she was okay as far as she thought when she was home. And she left there, and, I went about my business, and, we all wait for that call some days. And finally I got the call. And finally it was her one day about 6.5 years ago, and she said, "Dad, I'm in deep trouble. I don't think I'm going to make it. I don't know what to do." And what I want to share with you, by this time I'm 12 years sober in AA, and man, I'm sponsoring a lot of guys, and if you call me, I don't have any hesitation to tell anybody what they need to do or what step we need to work on or where we need to go. But I want to tell you something. All of a sudden, when it's your baby girl and she's 2,000 miles away and you can't get to her, it was a whole different ballgame. Because what it challenged me, guys, all of a sudden I was thinking, well, what do you think about the 12 steps now, Tim? What do you think about the A&A now, Tim? What do you think about your God now, Tim? Is it good enough for her? And man, everything in me, guys, wanted to get on an airplane and go out there and get her and bring her home. Everything, But something within me, and I think it's because I show up in the rooms here every day, had me say to her, "Honey, here's a man's name in L.A., and I hope you'll call him." But you know what I want to tell you? I hung up the phone and I sobbed for about 2 hours because I knew it was 50-50 whether or not she'd make that call or I'd go out there and bring her home in a box. But I also can tell you this, that when I hung up that phone, I knew I had told her all I had to give. Because all I have to give is the same thing you gave me. All I have to give is the same thing one guy named Bill gave the guy named Bob. And it's the only thing that I know that's worked for people that have the disease that I have. And it's the only thing, you see, I had to give her, even though she was my baby girl. And thank God, I'm so happy to report tonight, that this past July, her mom and I got on an airplane. We flew to Los Angeles to help her celebrate, her 6th year in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm really grateful for that. And the final thing I wanted to share is my middle son, who many times I leave out, and, again, in God's grace and mercy, One time back in the early days when he's about 6 months old, his mom, who was a nurse, went to the hospital and they left me with his 6-month-old baby. I took him to a beer drinking softball game in about 95-degree heat, got totally loaded, and brought him. When I came back, there was a thunderstorm, as I remember it. The bottom line was I dropped this baby. I was drunk and I dropped the baby. Right, his name's Terry, and I dropped him on his head. For a moment he turned all blue, and I called her and she came from the hospital. EMS came and they took him to the hospital. And of course, I remember going in like most drunks do. I'm sorry. I'll never do it again. And no sooner I got home, the first thing, when I found out he was all right, was the first thing I had to do was have a drink. Now here's the story I want to tell you. That was that child, and that was me that day. About 7 years ago, he has 4 kids now, and my oldest granddaughter was 4 years old at this time, and we always take him to Colorado on a ski trip in spring break. And we were there one day, and it so happened I was in the condominium with him, my son, and this little petite 4-year-old and a 3-year-old son. And all of a sudden, I heard him screaming and yelling, and I didn't know what was going on, and he was crying and screaming and yelling. I ran in the other room, and this little girl, this little 4-year-old, had lodged something in her throat. And she's so little that you just couldn't move it. And all the normal things that you do to try to make something happen there, it just wasn't going to work. And it was, just chaos. And there was nobody else. My wife wasn't there. There was nobody else around. It was me, him, and a 3-year-old. And we were at a point where there was nobody else around. There was no EMS. There was nobody else. We just had to do something. So, I picked up this baby and we started running down the hall of this place. And the next thing I know, guys, and I'll never know why, I just stopped. And I'm not even sure what happened, except, I got on my knees and I asked God to guide me. I blew in this kid's ears. I blew in her nose. I did everything that I could. And just asked God, please don't let her die here. And something happened and she choked just enough to dislodge this thing where some air can get down in there. And he was able to go from there and get EMS there, and they took her to Denver, and they saved her life. And I stayed behind. His mom went with him. I stayed behind with the 3-year-old. But what I wanted to share with you, when they came back, my son, the baby that I dropped as a drunk, he was 6 months old and almost killed him, came back to me and he said, Dad, we're at the hospital and the doctors don't understand why you did what you did, but they said, if you didn't do that, she was going to die. He said, Dad, I am so glad you're sober. I am so glad you're sober. And what I want to say, guys, is that, the deal is that, I'll often think what I would have done had she not lived. What I know for sure, I wouldn't have been alone. I would have had you guys. But what I also know for sure is that the miracle wasn't that morning that child lived. The miracle is that the drunk like me was able there to be used by God, because I sure in the hell didn't do it, in a way that I could give back to my son. And, I need to say that to you because this thing's about hope. It's about falling down on your nose, and I've done it time and time again the last 18 and a half years. But through God's grace and your help, I keep showing up one day at a time, because the life you've given me is like nothing else I could ever imagine I could ever work for. I really look forward to being here the rest of the time. It's a great group. I look forward to hearing Gary and Mike. And I look forward to meeting a lot of you guys. And if you see me wandering around here with that goofy look in my eyes or kind of far off, just come up and give me a hug, man, because probably starting to think I'm not getting respect to the man that I am. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to Sober Sunrise. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a thumbs up, as it will help share the message. Until next time, have a great day.